Hello there. The wine I'm taking a look at today is the second of the three wines I'm reviewing from Tenuta San Guido. This is their Guidalberto 2024, and essentially Guidalberto is a blend of Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, just to introduce Tenuta San Guido quickly, we're talking about a 2,500 hectare estate on the Tuscan coast in the Maremma region near the village of Bolgheri, and the land comprising this estate was owned by the della Gherardesca family for over 1,200 years. The della Gherardescas are an old, noble Tuscan family who have owned this land since the Middle Ages, and the estate is named after one of their 13th century ancestors, San Guido della Gherardesca. And the estate actually changed hands in 1930 when Marchese Mario Incisa della Rocchetta married Clarice della Gherardesca, and the couple were given the estate as a wedding present. Initially, they used it more as a holiday home. The Marchese himself was originally from Piedmont. He had studied agriculture and had experimented with viticulture and winemaking. He was a lover of Bordeaux. When he came to Tenuta San Guido, he realised that some of the soil types here, the clays and the gravels over a limestone subsoil, were very similar to some of the soils that you see in Bordeaux, particularly in the Grave region. And so he began experimenting with growing French grape varieties, particularly Cabernet Sauvignon and also some Cabernet Franc, although he did also plant Canaiolo, a local Tuscan variety. These first plantings took place in 1944, and when the Marchese showed the wines to his neighbours, the people he showed them to were unused to the idea of structured wines that would age for many years, and frankly they weren't very well received. And so the wines he'd made from Cabernet Sauvignon took something of a back seat, staying in the cellars for several years before he chose to revisit them. At which stage he was actually quite encouraged by what he tasted and started showing them to friends, family and visitors, and eventually ended up in conversation with a relative by marriage, Piero Antinori, who saw some real virtue in the wines. And the two of them struck upon the idea of commercializing the wine. They got Giacomo Takis, Antinori's leading winemaker at the time, involved in the project, and they released first bottles of Sassicaia from the 1968 vintage in 1971, despite the fact that the wine wasn't able to claim a DOC and had to be sold under the label of a Vino da Tavola, a simple table wine. Sassicaia proved very popular. In fact, such was its popularity that a number of estates started producing wines along similar lines in the region. So that by 1994, Bolgheri had its own DOC. So while Marchese Mario Incisa della Rocchetta had developed Sassicaia, it was his son Nicolo who was responsible for the development of Guidalberto. In that he saw that one of their neighbours, Ornellaia, was having a lot of success with a wine made from pure Merlot that they were making called Merceto, and so discussed with the oenologist Giacomo Takis the idea of planting Merlot on the estate as well. This occurred in the early 1990s. Richer, heavier soils in slightly warmer areas at lower altitudes, sort of between 100 and 200 metres above sea level, were selected and Merlot was planted here. The year 2000 saw the first vintage produced of Guidalberto, making this wine, the 2024 vintage, the 25th vintage of the wine. I should just say that as well as developing winemaking on the estate, there's also the Dumello Olgiata racing stables. They have a wildlife reserve, the Padule di Bolgheri. They have interests in forestry. They have over 10,000 olive trees that are over a century old, producing olive oil. And as well as that, they practice mixed agriculture, growing crops and breeding cattle. Now, the name of the wine, Guidalberto, honours a family ancestor, Guido Alberto della Gherardesca, a 19th century agricultural pioneer in the Bolgheri area, who did a lot for the local economy, building churches and factories, and he's also responsible for the planting of the iconic avenue of cypress trees, the Viale di Cipressi, that runs through Bolgheri. Currently, the estate is looking to promote Guidalberto more as its own standalone wine. In the past, it's perhaps been seen as a second wine to Sassicaia. That's never really been true because Sassicaia has never contained any Merlot. Thus, most of the fruit that going into this isn't fruit that's being declassified from a higher level wine. Instead, what is actually happening is that they're using fruit from dedicated parcels of vines to go into Guidalberto. And as of this year, 2026, the wine will be made in a separate winery that's been being built here over the last 4 years. Viticulture on the estate is registered as being sustainable, and they have certification from an organisation with the acronym SQNPI. Now, the 2024 season began with a cold, rainy autumn, which was followed by a mild, dry winter. And as a result, there was earlier heat accumulation at the start of the year than had been the case in 2023. However, in late February and in March, the cold weather returned, and that was accompanied by continuous rain, which restored some much needed water reserves to the soil. And actually, cool March temperatures didn't hinder the start of the vegetative cycle, and warm, sunny weather in the first part of April gave an early and very uniform bud break. The second half of April, unfortunately, saw a return to cold, wet conditions. It was fortunate there were no frosts and there wasn't any snow. May and June, however, provided optimal conditions for flowering and fruit set. July was warm, although they refer to it as well ventilated. I take that as meaning breezy. And the warm temperature ensured that veraison, the colour change in the grapes, happened about a week earlier than normal. High temperatures were maintained, but then once again a front came through. In fact, there was some rainfall at the beginning of harvest. The conditions were such, however, that phenolic ripeness was reached at about the same time as technical maturity in terms of sugars and acidity had been achieved. So in general, the fruit that was harvested is very well balanced. In fact, particularly the Cabernet Sauvignon ripened really well at the end of the season. Once rains had finished in late August, warm conditions were ideal for ripening tannins, and yet cool nights managed to preserve acidity well. Thankfully, the fruit that was collected was mostly in clean, healthy condition. Now, the wet, stop-start conditions of the vintage had actually mitigated against the Merlot and made it hard to achieve the desired ripeness without intervention. And in fact, they went in and they thinned the crop. And although that did much to improve the quality of the fruit, of course it reduced the yield. And thankfully, the late ripening Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't affected in the same way. As a result, once again, following on from 2023, this is an unusual vintage for Guidalberto, in which there's actually more Cabernet Sauvignon at 52% than there is Merlot in the blend. Normally this is a blend of sort of 60% of Merlot to 40% of Cabernet. And that actually brings me to another point, because actually currently Tenuta San Guido aren't able every year to meet their needs for Merlot. And about 10% of the Merlot going into this wine was purchased from other estates. However, they do have plans so that within a period of about 3 to 5 years, they should be able to fully meet their own needs for Merlot from their own vineyards. Now, harvest for the Merlot began on the 28th of August, and the Merlot parcels were picked first at Tenuta San Guido. All the plots are vinified separately, and blending only goes on after a period of barrel maturation. Cabernet Sauvignon was harvested later, and harvest in 2024 concluded on the 5th of October. Fermentation took place in temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks, and fermentation was completed by late October. Fermentation here is conducted using what they call autochthonous yeasts. These aren't necessarily wild ferments, but what they do is they will select yeasts that come into the winery on the fruit. Those will then be cultured, and that culture coming from a yeast from within their own vineyards is what is used to instigate fermentations. Also, malolactic conversion took place spontaneously, and that was finished by the end of November, at which stage the wine went into oak to mature. They're using 225 litre oak barrels. Predominantly those were French. They say about 90% of the oak was French, and the balance, the remaining 10%, was made up of Hungarian, German and some Slavonian oak. Of these barrels, 40% were new and 60% were either second or third fill barrels. The wine aged in oak for 13 months and then subsequently is allowed to spend a few months aging in bottle prior to its release, which I believe will occur to international customers in June. Evidently, 400,000 bottles of Guidalberto were produced in 2024. So let's take a look at it and see what we make of it, shall we? The wine has a very vibrant, sort of almost cherry red, medium intensity, medium to dark intensity of colour. Swirling it, it's labelled as having 13.5% alcohol. The technical stats say that's 13.48, but that's splitting hairs slightly. It's quite readily forming some very obvious tears on the side of the glass there. So given the fact that's not particularly high alcohol, I'm expecting that that should have quite a good tannic structure to produce that sort of density in it. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? There is a lovely lifted red fruit element here. It's juicy, bright fruit. It makes me think of mulberries and raspberries. And yet at the same time, there's actually some depth and some structure. So much more sort of juicy red plum, possibly even some dark fruit, sort of dams and bullace, and sort of darker stone fruit. And there are just some high-toned notes of sweet spices, touches of cedar, touches of nutmeg. Really just hints on the top level of those perfumes, not in any way overwhelming them. So let's have a taste. The wine is at most medium bodied, but there is a lovely, smooth, velvety structure. I think some of the lightness and elegance is a result of really good, fresh acidity, which is combining with those fine tannins, just to give them a slight, bitter, mouth-watering edge. However, such as the lovely, juicy fruit that's sort of showing us red currants, mulberries, and juicy, crisp red plums on the mid-palate, there isn't really any tartness. There's just enough for a slight, mouth-watering, crunchy element there. And I can feel just a hint of rather sort of plush, smooth cedriness at the finish of the palate there. The wine is incredibly harmonious and very well balanced. The alcohol isn't intruding or smothering the fruit. The oak is beautifully integrated and encased with the fruit. It's not a huge wine, and it's effortlessly providing a long, concentrated, yet fresh finish. I can remember being absolutely mesmerised by the aromas of Guido Guidalberto. Certainly I'm tasting this wine at an earlier point in its development, but I don't see this wine in quite the same way. It has beautiful aromas, and I'm sure they will evolve, develop and open beautifully. However, this is much more a beautiful wine of balance. There's no particular element that stands out enormously. It managed to combine wonderfully precise fruit and a beautiful harmony of its elements. The flavours are lasting effortlessly. I took a look to see if there was a Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine. As of yet, there isn't. However, I do think this is a wine that is currently easily worth 92 points out of 100. And I may well be being unfair to it there, because it is just so balanced and so harmonious. And I strongly suspect it's a wine that will develop relatively quickly to show much, much more. It's probably going to command a score of something like 93 out of 100. Once again, I'll come back to the fact that this will probably be available for about a fifth of the price of Sassicaia. And while I wouldn't claim that it is a relatively scaled down example of Sassicaia, it contains many of those same elements of harmony and balance, and yet has its own wonderful individualistic Merlot-based character, sort of epitomised by those juicy, fresh red plum notes that come to the fore on the nose and on the mid-palate. A wonderfully harmonious wine that's just delivering beautifully. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. I would very much appreciate that. If you're watching these tastings and you haven't subscribed, it would be fantastic if you consider doing that, please. And if you do set yourself an alert and make sure that you're notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you have any comments about this wine or any of the other wines I'm looking at, or anything else relating to that, or any questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at and the tastings I'm doing. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if and when it's available near you and at what price. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the near future. Most specifically, my next tasting will be of the 2023 Sassicaia, so that's probably one you shouldn't miss. Anyway, hopefully see you there. Bye for now.